They say that when you become a parent, you're not supposed to pick your favorite kids. However, I don't have any children, but I do have 2 cameras. In 2025, I did pick up the GFX50R on an insane deal, and I also got the Fuji X100VI. Now, this isn't necessarily a video to tell you what you should buy, but one of the curiosities, at least that I had, was what's the difference between an APS-C sensor and something that's going to be bigger than full frame? And today I'm going to compare some of the images between the GFX50R, which is a medium format sensor, versus something that's a bit smaller in the APS-C. We'll get there. So if you've never heard of a medium format sensor, or maybe you're just afraid to ask, I'm going to explain what one is. Now, medium format sensors are going to be larger than full frame, and full frame sensors are larger than APS-C. Getting a little bit more mathy, a medium format sensor is going to be about 43.8 millimeters by 32.9 millimeters, making it a surface area of, well, this number. And on the flip side, an APS-C sensor is going to be a lot smaller at 23.5 millimeters by 15.6 millimeters, giving it this number, making it about 4 times smaller. Now, all of that math might not mean anything, but I'm going to show you a diagram of how large a medium format sensor is and compare it to something that's APS-C. Now, this is going to have 2 different implications on your image, which is going to be field of view and depth of field. Now, basically what we're going to try to do here is do something called a full frame equivalency. That way we're going to try to figure out which focal length we're going to need in order to make these 2 cameras equal for the majority of this test. Although there's one little thing in here that's going to come in handy or make you really mad a little bit later. Now I'm going to use 35 millimeters at full frame as an example. In order to go from APS-C to full frame to get the similar field of view, what I have to do is divide that 35 millimeters by 1.5, which will give you around 23 millimeters, which ironically enough is the focal length of the X100VI. It's a 23 millimeter lens. And in order to go from medium format to full frame, you have to take that same 35 number and divide it by 0.79, which is going to give you a number of really close to something like 45, which is going to present a little bit of a niggle. And by niggle, I mean a persistent thing that causes an annoyance or anxiety. So watch your language. But basically the reason why I'm saying this is going to create a little bit of a problem is because the only lens that I do have is my 50 millimeter f3.5, which is about 5 millimeters off. And I'm not going to buy a $2,000 lens just to make this video because I spend money doing even dumber things. But I hope that you guys can forgive me in terms of having a 5 millimeter off thing, but I think a lot of the things I'm going to say are still going to hold up. Now, we also have to consider as well is going to be our depth of field, because different sensor sizes is going to give you more or less depth of field if you keep the focal length consistent. For example, if I made the apertures exactly the same, I didn't make any sort of equivalence, and I used a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame and a medium format camera, the depth of field is going to be a little bit different. So not only are we going to have to get things to equate our field of view, but we're also going to have to change our aperture in order to equate our depth of field. If I decided to stand at the exact same place with equivalent lenses but at the same aperture, you're going to notice that there's going to be more depth of field out of a medium format sensor versus a full frame versus an APS-C. This is where we are going to have to use a little bit of math to make sure that our depth of field is going to be equatable. That way, when we do these comparisons, it's going to make a lot more sense. Because if you're going from APS-C into medium format in terms of trying to equate the depth of field using your aperture, you're going to go all the way up to pretty close to an f4. It's like f3.8, but I just don't have f3.8 on this lens. Now, the fact that that's going to be in the middle, it can go 3.5 or it can go f4, but I'm just going to use f4 for most of these tests. Conversely, if I wanted to go to f2.8 on the X100VI, I'd have to use f5.3 on my GFX, which would still give you an equivalent depth of field, but also keep in mind, aperture is still aperture. I tried doing this in a couple of examples where I tried stopping down to f5.6 to be more equivalent to my X100VI, but also like aperture is still aperture, and you're still going to make your image a bit darker. So you do have to adjust things like your ISO or even your shutter speed if we're talking about photos in order to make sure that we try to keep things equivalent in terms of exposure. But just for the sake of this video, we're going to shoot both of these things wide open. Now, if we look at these 2 images in a vacuum, you're probably going to say both are great pictures, both are just fine. However, when you put them side by side, you're probably also going to say both are great and both are just fine. However, one of these looks a little bit different than the other one. Now, one of the things you're going to notice with a bigger sensor like a GFX sensor is there's going to be more things called photo sites. That's a long mumbo jumbo way of saying that your highlights and your shadows are going to retain a little bit more detail while working with the bigger sensor. That's why some of the roll-offs and some of the transitions between the darker parts and the lighter parts of the image look a little bit better on a GFX50R versus the X100VI. Now, both these guys do have fairly high megapixel counts, the GFX having 50 millimeters and the X100VI having 40, which both are going to be just fine in terms of being able to zoom in order to reframe your image. However, when we re-zoom in as well, you're going to notice a bokeh looks a little bit different, which might be a case of maybe that 5mm difference, but it doesn't look so different from each other that it's going to be earth-shattering. Now, if you want to send your background or out of focus areas into the shadow realm, then using a bigger sensor, using a wider aperture is going to be something that's going to suit your favor. However, this is a two-way conversation when we talk about out of focus areas. I decided to do a close-up on here as well and keep everything else the same in terms of field of view and also equate my depth of field, but the X100VI actually has more in focus, despite the fact that it's shooting at f2 versus the f4 on my medium format camera. I guess what can be said here is that if you have a smaller sensor, more things are going to be in focus if you equate the apertures for things. So if you need to get a little bit more detail and you don't necessarily need to obliterate your backgrounds, you can get more focus in some of the finer details. If you're looking at the necklace or some of the skin tones on the shoulder, those things are going to be fairly sharp, while at the same time, the face itself is going to be sharp as well. Now, this might be something specifically to the X100VI because it's a fixed lens camera, so the distance between like the end of the glass and the sensor are closer, but it was an observation that I made when I was comparing these two cameras. Now, with the ability to get more of background separation while also having a wider field of view technically means that you can move a little bit closer to subjects and get the blurred out background at the same time, which is unique to the medium format sensor. At least that's the way that it's explained to me. However, when talking about minimum focusing distance between the GFX50R and the X100VI, because the minimum focusing distance on my 50mm f3.5 lens is about 55 centimeters, which is almost about 2 feet. Where the X100VI, it's like 10, which means I can get really close up in this close-up shot of actually getting things in focus. This also might have to do a little bit with the minimum focusing distance, but the areas that were out of focus in the previous example were farther away from the things I did get in focus. So all of that to say is that the minimum focusing distance, getting things sharp, and almost using this as a little bit of a macro lens on the X100VI is something that it does better than my GFX paired with the 50mm f3.5. Now, I'm not somebody that does the whole fairy lights thing because I don't really care about the size of somebody else's bokeh balls. However, the transition between focus and out of focus areas or bokeh are going to be a little bit different between the two sensor sizes. Now, again, in a vacuum, neither one of these two are going to be bad. However, on a larger sensor, on the GFX50R, to my eye, I think that the GFX50R is just a little bit more pleasing. Now, hopefully that's going to be right because these cameras are a lot more expensive than the X100VI. However, while working with a larger sensor, not only are you going to get more depth of field, but in my personal opinion, I think it looks a little bit nicer. I tried taking a couple of photos while having textured backgrounds like leaves or plants or things like clothing, and I found that some of those finer details when they're out of focus and when they're out of focus just look a little bit better while working with the bigger sensor. Now, there is one thing where you are really going to see the difference between a medium format sensor and something that's smaller like an APS-C, and that's when shooting at low light. Keeping everything else the same between our aperture, our shutter speed, one of the things you're going to notice on a bigger sensor is you're going to be able to perform a lot better in low light situations versus using an APS-C camera. I took a bunch of photos at night in Toronto just to see what the low light performance is going to be on either one of these two cameras. And one of the things that I did notice that the smaller sensor camera, if you keep everything the same and you don't touch anything, it might not have the most amount of noise in the world, but if you want to pull up a little bit of those details, especially if you equate the ISOs, it's just not going to perform as good as a GFX50R. This also means that with the bigger sensor, you're going to be able to operate in lower light situations by being able to pump a bit more ISO and still keep the image clean. I've done this a couple of times where I've shot at 2000 ISO, 2500 ISO, and the image has just been fine and it didn't break apart and have a ton of noise. Having a fast lens is one thing, however, it is going to be fixed on the X100VI, so you can only go so high. But being able to use something that you can technically get a 1.7 lens if you're completely rich, but even while shooting at f4, I'm still going to be able to pump up my ISO and get the images, especially in some darker areas. Now, before you rush to B&H and you start looking at medium format cameras, also you have to keep in mind there's a couple of downsides with using medium format GFX cameras like the GFX50R. For one, the GFX50R is discontinued. You can't really buy it in a retail store. But anyways, medium format cameras are going to be bigger and bulkier than their APS-C counterparts. So if you're somebody that's not in the gym or you just don't want to carry a heavy camera, looking at the next medium format camera, despite the fact that it does have a lot of cool features, might not be something necessarily that you want to add into your kit. Now, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, but also the bigger the camera, the slower it is. Taking a photo on a GFX50R, you have to wait like 2 seconds to be able to see the photo or to take another one. The blackout period is a little bit longer. Now, that might be different on more expensive cameras, but also medium format cameras are more expensive. If you want to compare the GFX100 Mark II versus the X100VI, or even the GFX100RF versus the X100VI, they're going to be a significant price point between each other. That means these medium format cameras are going to be a lot slower, they're going to be more expensive, and as well as they fundamentally just have less lenses. Now, that might be a moot point when talking about the X100VI because you only really get one lens and you can't really change anything. Now, if you're looking to get a grip of GF lenses, you're not only going to spend a ton of money because they are incredibly expensive, but also there's just not a lot of them. But at the end of the day, I did say this isn't necessarily a video telling you what you should buy. I kind of wanted to see the differences between the GFX system and the X100 system, and I just came up with some of the results here, and you guys can take a look at them. I'm also not talking about this from the perspective of an expert. I'm not a photography expert. I've not made a lot of photography videos. However, I was curious, and I figured that I would answer it because I have access to these cameras because, well, I bought them. They're mine. I can't really give them back to anyone. They're my cameras. That being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video or you learned a thing or two about GFX sensors versus the X100 series. If you guys want to see more videos, it's probably not going to be about a Fuji camera because we get a special delivery in the next couple of days. But you're going to have to wait till the next video in order to see that. See you in the next one. Peace.